He was a decorated soldier who came home a hero, but 3 years later he was sleeping under a bridge, forgotten by the country he nearly died to protect, until one desperate night led him to an abandoned military bunker that would change everything. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The snow fell thick and relentless over the hills of rural Virginia, blanketing the forgotten corners of a town that time had stopped caring about. Wind howled through the bare trees like a warning, bending branches until they cracked and surrendered to the weight of winter. Somewhere beneath an overpass on the edge of that dying town, a man sat hunched inside a threadbare tent, his breath rising in short, visible puffs that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. His name was Marcus, no last name anymore. Not to the world anyway, just Marcus. 38 years old, though the lines carved into his face suggested someone much older. His hands, once steady enough to defuse bombs under enemy fire, now trembled from cold and something deeper. Something broken inside that no medic could stitch back together. He pulled the thin sleeping bag tighter around his shoulders and stared at the concrete wall of the overpass. Someone had spray-painted words there years ago, faded now but still visible. Freedom isn't free. Marcus let out a bitter laugh that rattled in his chest. No, it wasn't. And sometimes the price kept collecting long after you thought you'd paid in full. 3 years. That's how long it had been since he wore the uniform, since he stood tall and proud in formation, since anyone called him sergeant or soldier or brother. Now they called him nothing at all. They looked through him like he was made of glass, just another invisible man with a cardboard sign and a story nobody wanted to hear. But Marcus had a story. Everyone does. His just happened to be written in blood and shrapnel and the screaming silence that follows an explosion you weren't supposed to survive. The memory crept in uninvited, the way it always did when the cold got bad enough. He was back in Kandahar, summer of 2014. The sun hung merciless in a bleached sky, heat rising off the sand in waves that made the horizon shimmer like a mirage. His unit had been tasked with clearing a road suspected of containing improvised explosive devices, routine work for a combat engineer. Find the bombs before they found you. Marcus had done it 100 times. He was good at it, maybe the best in his battalion. His hands knew the feel of buried wire, the subtle disturbance in packed earth that meant death waited just below the surface. He trusted those hands, trusted his instincts, trusted his training, but that day his instincts failed him, or maybe the enemy had simply gotten smarter. The device was buried deeper than usual, connected to a secondary trigger he never saw coming. One moment he was kneeling in the dust, tools spread beside him, sweat dripping into his eyes. The next moment, the world turned white and silent. They told him later that the blast threw him 15 feet. That his helmet saved his skull but couldn't save everything inside it. That 2 men from his unit pulled him from the smoking crater while rounds cracked overhead, dragging him to cover while his blood painted the sand behind them. Marcus remembered none of it. What he remembered was waking in a hospital in Germany, tubes running from his arms, machines beeping in rhythms that meant nothing to him. A nurse with kind eyes told him he was lucky. Lucky. That word bounced around his fractured mind like a cruel joke. The traumatic brain injury changed everything. His thoughts came slower now, tangled like old fishing line. Words sometimes escaped him mid-sentence, leaving him stranded in conversations he couldn't finish. Headaches arrived without warning, blinding and brutal, lasting hours or sometimes days. And the nightmares. God, the nightmares never stopped. They gave him a Purple Heart and a medical discharge. They shook his hand and thanked him for his service. They promised the Veterans Administration would take care of him. And then they sent him home to a world that had kept spinning while he lay bleeding in the sand. His wife, Diana, tried. Marcus knew she tried. For almost 2 years she stood beside him while he raged at shadows and woke screaming in the dark. She held him through the panic attacks that left him curled on the bathroom floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. She drove him to appointments at the VA that always seemed to end with more paperwork and fewer answers. But love, Marcus learned, has limits. Even the strongest love eventually buckles under enough weight. The night Diana left, she didn't yell, didn't accuse. She just stood in the doorway of their small apartment with a suitcase in her hand and tears streaming down her face. "I can't save you," she whispered, "and watching you drown is killing me too." He wanted to argue, wanted to promise he would get better, find help, become the man she married. But the words stuck in his throat like broken glass, and all he could do was watch her walk away. The door clicked shut behind her with a sound softer than a bomb, but somehow more final. After that, everything accelerated. Without Diana's income, the bills piled up faster than he could manage. His disability checks arrived late, got lost, required forms he couldn't understand to process. The VA appointments stretched from weeks to months. Every time he called, a different voice told him to be patient, to wait his turn, to understand that resources were limited. Resources were limited. He heard that phrase so many times it stopped meaning anything. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday in March. Marcus remembered because it was raining, a cold spring rain that smelled like mud and endings. He stood in the empty apartment, his few remaining possessions stuffed into a duffel bag, and realized he had nowhere to go. No family left. No friends who hadn't already drifted away, uncomfortable with the stranger he had become. No safety net at all. That first night on the street, he slept beneath the awning of a closed hardware store, using his duffel as a pillow. He told himself it was temporary, just until he figured things out. Just until the VA came through. Just until something changed. But nothing changed. Weeks turned to months, months turned to more months. The shelters filled up fast and asked too many questions. The missions required sobriety he couldn't always maintain, not when the bottle was the only thing that quieted the screaming in his head. So he drifted. From doorway to underpass, from bench to bridge, from the man he used to be to the ghost he had become. 18 months. That's how long Marcus had been homeless when the storm rolled in. He knew it was coming. You learn to read the sky when your life depends on finding shelter before the weather turns deadly. The clouds had been building all day, thick and grey and heavy with intent. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By evening, the first flakes began to fall. Marcus huddled deeper into his tent, a flimsy thing he'd found discarded behind a camping store months ago. The fabric was torn in 2 places, patched with duct tape that was starting to peel. It wouldn't hold against a serious storm, he knew that. But knowing and being able to do something about it were different things. The tent city had thinned out over the past week as word of the coming cold front spread. The smart ones headed south or found their way into the overflow shelters downtown. But Marcus had stayed, stubborn maybe, or just too tired to run anymore. Around him, the few remaining souls did what they could. Old Pete wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and crawled into the drainage pipe he called home. Maria and her teenage son pressed together in their battered van, engine running to keep the heat flowing until the gas ran out. And somewhere deeper in the camp, someone coughed, a wet, rattling sound that promised pneumonia if the cold didn't get them first. By 9 o'clock, the snow was coming down in sheets. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals into every gap and seam. Marcus's tent began to shake, the poles bending under the assault. He knew he had maybe an hour, 2 at most, before the whole structure collapsed. He closed his eyes and tried to think. The downtown shelters would be full by now, packed with bodies and bureaucracy. The hospital might take him if he claimed a medical emergency, but they'd kick him out by morning, and the walk back would be just as deadly. He needed somewhere close, somewhere dry, somewhere forgotten. And then it came to him, a memory from his early days in the service when he was stationed at Fort Peterson before his first deployment. The older sergeants used to tell stories about the Cold War installations scattered throughout the Virginia hills, bunkers and listening posts and underground facilities built during an era when nuclear annihilation seemed inevitable. Most had been decommissioned decades ago, stripped of anything valuable and left to rot, but one of them, according to the stories, had never been properly closed. Budget cuts or bureaucratic oversight or simple human error. The reasons varied with whoever told the tale. It sat somewhere in the hills north of town, hidden beneath a concrete cap that was supposed to have been demolished, but never was. Marcus had never gone looking for it, never had a reason to, but he remembered the general location, remembered the landmarks the old-timers described. And right now, in the howling grip of a storm that wanted to kill him, it was the only idea he had. He grabbed his duffel, shoved his sleeping bag inside, and crawled out of the tent just as the first pole snapped. The wind hit him like a physical force, driving needles of ice into every exposed inch of skin. He could barely see 3 feet in front of him, but he started walking anyway, north toward the hills, toward a place that might not even exist anymore. The hike took longer than it should have. Marcus's legs, weakened by months of malnutrition and neglect, burned with every step. The snow came up past his ankles, then his calves. His boots, held together with wire and prayer, let in moisture that numbed his toes within minutes. More than once, he stumbled and fell, face first into the white nothing, and had to fight the urge to simply stay down. But something kept him moving. Stubbornness, maybe. Or that old soldier's instinct that whispered, "You don't get to quit until the mission is complete." So he pushed forward, one step at a time, climbing higher into hills that seemed determined to push him back. After what felt like hours, he saw it. A concrete structure jutting from the hillside, half buried by decades of growth and neglect. The entrance was exactly as the old stories described, a reinforced door set into a sloping cap designed to survive everything short of a direct nuclear strike. Marcus staggered toward it, hope and exhaustion warring in his chest. The door was rusted, the handle stiff, but the lock had corroded to nothing years ago. He threw his weight against the metal once, twice, and on the third try it groaned open. Stale air rushed out to greet him, cold but dry, carrying the scent of dust and forgotten time. He stumbled inside and pulled the door shut behind him, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. For a long moment, Marcus just stood there, breathing. Then he pulled out the small flashlight he always carried and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a concrete corridor that stretched deeper into the hill. Pipes ran along the ceiling, crusted with rust. The floor was littered with debris, fallen ceiling tiles, scattered papers, the occasional dead leaf that had blown in over the years. But the structure itself was solid, intact, safe. Marcus walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The corridor opened into a larger room, some kind of operations center by the look of it. Desks sat in rows, covered with dust, their chairs pushed back as if the occupants had stepped away and simply never returned. Old equipment lined the walls, radio consoles, monitoring stations, filing cabinets with faded labels. He found a corner with relatively clean floor space and sank down against the wall. His muscles screamed in protest. His lungs ached from the cold air he'd been gulping during the hike. But he was inside. He was dry, and for the first time in a very long while, he was alone in a way that felt peaceful rather than punishing. Marcus closed his eyes and let the silence wrap around him. Within minutes, he was asleep. He dreamed of explosions. He always did. But this time, something was different. Instead of waking in the hospital, he found himself standing in a vast underground chamber surrounded by golden light. Voices echoed from somewhere he couldn't see, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. And at the center of the chamber stood a door, massive, vault-like, covered in symbols he almost recognized. He woke to grey light filtering through cracks he hadn't noticed before. Hours had passed. The storm outside had quieted, though he could still hear wind moaning through the trees. His body ached in ways he didn't want to catalogue. But he was alive. That counted for something. Marcus ate the last of his food, half a granola bar and a bruised apple he'd scavenged from behind a grocery store 2 days ago, and decided to explore deeper. If he was going to use this place as shelter, he might as well learn its secrets. The bunker was larger than he expected. Beyond the operations room, a corridor branched in 3 directions. He chose the center path, following it past empty storage rooms and a barrack-style sleeping area with bunk beds still bolted to the walls. Further in, he found a kitchen with rusted appliances, a bathroom with dry pipes, and a medical bay stripped of everything except a single examination table. But it was the eastern corridor that changed everything. At first, Marcus thought it was a dead end. The passage terminated in what appeared to be a collapsed section of wall, concrete blocks and twisted rebar piled in a heap that reached almost to the ceiling. But something about it felt wrong. The debris was too neat, too deliberate. It looked less like a collapse and more like a barricade. His combat engineer instincts, dormant for so long, stirred to life. Marcus approached the pile and began examining it, running his hands along the edges, testing the stability of individual blocks. Beneath the surface layer, he felt something smooth, metal, cold. It took him almost an hour to clear enough debris to confirm his suspicion. Behind the concrete pile was a door, not concrete like the rest of the bunker, but steel, thick and heavy, set into a frame that looked far newer than anything else in the facility. There were no handles on this door, no visible hinges, just a keypad with numbers 0 through 9 and a small screen that flickered to life when he brushed dust from its surface. "Enter authorization code," the screen read. Marcus stared at it. His mind raced backward through years of training, security protocols, access codes he'd been required to memorize and then ordered to forget. Most of it had been specific to his unit, useless here. But there were universal codes too. Emergency overrides designed for situations where normal authorization wasn't possible. He tried 3 combinations from memory. The first 2 produced nothing but angry beeps. The third made the screen flash yellow. Partial authorization accepted. Enter secondary verification. Marcus frowned. Secondary verification usually meant biometrics, fingerprints or retinal scans. But the equipment here was old. Older than that technology, maybe. He noticed a small slot beside the keypad, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a card reader, the kind used for magnetic strips in the 1980s. But he had no card. What he did have was a set of metal dog tags hanging around his neck. Tags he'd worn every day since basic training, even after everything else fell apart. Tags stamped with his name, his blood type, his service number. On impulse, Marcus pulled them over his head and slid one of the tags into the slot. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. Service member identified. Access granted. The door hissed. Hydraulics that had sat dormant for decades groaned back to life, and slowly, impossibly, the steel barrier began to swing open. What Marcus saw on the other side stopped his heart. A chamber, massive, cathedral-like, carved into the bedrock beneath the hill, and filling that chamber from floor to ceiling were crates. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, stacked in perfect rows, each one marked with numbers and codes and classification stamps that made his breath catch in his throat. But it wasn't the crates that drew his eye. It was what sat beyond them, gleaming under emergency lights that flickered on as he stepped inside. A vault. A real vault. The kind you see in bank heist movies, with a door 3 feet thick and a wheel the size of a steering column. And that vault door was open, just a crack, but enough to see the glow of something golden beyond. Marcus walked forward as if in a trance. He reached the vault. He pulled the door wider, and he looked inside. Gold, bars of it, stacked neatly on metal shelves. Bundles of cash so old the paper had yellowed. Wooden boxes filled with coins that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 directions. Filing cabinets stuffed with documents bearing seals he recognized, Department of Defense, Treasury, classifications so high they had no names he knew. His knees gave out. He sank to the cold floor of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than he had ever imagined in his entire life, and began to laugh. It started small, just a chuckle escaping through cracked lips. But it grew, fed by exhaustion and disbelief, and 18 months of sleeping under bridges while the country he'd bled for looked the other way. The laughter echoed off the walls of that impossible chamber, bouncing back to him until he couldn't tell if he was laughing or crying or both. And in that moment, homeless and broken and surrounded by $300 million in forgotten treasure, Marcus realized something had shifted. His life would never be the same. Marcus sat in the mouth of the vault for a long time, his back pressed against the cold steel door, his eyes moving across the impossible wealth before him. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Gold bars, each one stamped with serial numbers and dates stretching back to the 1950s. Cash bundled in denominations he'd only seen in movies. $10,000 stacks of $100 bills, their paper crisp despite decades in the dark. Coins that looked ancient, some bearing faces of presidents, others marked with eagles and Latin phrases he couldn't translate. But it was the documents that pulled him from his stupor. Filing cabinets lined the back wall of the vault, their drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry and never bothered to close them properly. Marcus pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking, and walked toward them. The first drawer contained what looked like inventory lists, page after page of handwritten entries, each one cataloguing the contents of the vault with military precision. Gold bullion, £27,000, bearer bonds, face value $43 million, emergency currency reserves, 12 million in mixed denominations. The numbers blurred together until they stopped making sense. The second drawer was different. These weren't inventories. They were reports, briefings, memos marked with classification stamps that had turned brown with age. Marcus pulled one out at random and began to read. Operation Continuity, Phase 4 Implementation, dated November 1962. The document outlined something called the Presidential Succession Reserve, a network of hidden facilities designed to ensure the survival of the federal government in the event of nuclear war. Each facility was to be stocked with enough resources to sustain operations for a minimum of 18 months. Food, water, medical supplies, communication equipment, and financial reserves sufficient to rebuild the economy from scratch. Marcus turned to the next page. A map showed the locations of 12 such facilities, scattered across the eastern seaboard. Most had been crossed out with red ink, annotated with dates and the word decommissioned. But one, the one where he now stood, had a different notation. Status inactive, closure pending budget allocation, guardian assigned, guardian assigned. Marcus frowned at the phrase. He dug deeper into the drawer and found more documents, these ones personal rather than official. Letters, some typed, others handwritten. They told a story that made his chest tighten. The guardian's name was Colonel Edward Hayes, Army Corps of Engineers, retired. The letters revealed a man who had devoted the final decades of his life to a secret even his own family didn't fully understand. He had been assigned to oversee the facility's closure in 1973, but the funding never came. Year after year, the paperwork got lost in bureaucratic shuffle. And year after year, Colonel Hayes kept watch. At first, according to his letters, he expected someone to come. Inspectors, demolition crews, someone official to take the responsibility off his shoulders. But no one ever did. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The threat of nuclear annihilation faded into memory, and the forgotten vault remained forgotten. The colonel's tone changed as the years passed. The early letters were formal, addressed to superiors who never responded. The later ones became more personal, more philosophical. One, dated March of 1998, was addressed simply to whoever comes after me. Marcus sat down on an old wooden crate and read it slowly. To whoever finds these words, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered what I could not bring myself to destroy or surrender. Perhaps you think me a fool. Perhaps you think me a thief. I assure you I am neither. For 25 years, I have been the guardian of this place. I watched it every day, waiting for orders that never came. I reported its existence through channels that no longer existed. I did everything duty demanded, and duty gave me nothing in return but silence. So I made a choice. I left it here. Not for myself. God knows I never touched a single coin for personal gain, but because I came to believe the system that created this vault was no longer capable of using it wisely. I watched my country send young men to die in wars without end. I watched veterans return home broken, only to be abandoned by the institutions sworn to protect them. I watched the rich grow richer while the poor learned to disappear. This money was meant for emergencies, for moments when everything else had failed. And perhaps that moment has finally come, not in the form of nuclear fire, but in the slow erosion of everything we once believed. Whoever you are, I hope you need this. I hope you have seen enough darkness to recognize light when you find it. And I hope you will do what I could not. Use it for those the system forgot. God forgive me if I was wrong. Colonel Edward Hayes. Marcus read the letter twice, then a third time. By the fourth reading, his vision had blurred with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. The system forgot. Those 3 words echoed through the empty chambers of his mind. He thought of the VA appointments that never happened, the disability checks that arrived too late, the shelters that turned him away, and the bridges that became his home. He thought of every time he'd reached out for help and felt nothing but cold air where a hand should have been. The system had forgotten him, just like it had forgotten Colonel Hayes, just like it had forgotten this vault and everything it represented. Marcus looked around at the stacks of gold, the bundles of cash, the fortune that fate had dropped into his frozen, trembling hands. For a brief moment, he imagined what it would mean to walk away wealthy, to check into a hotel with a soft bed and hot water, to eat a meal he didn't have to scavenge from garbage bins, to become overnight the kind of person the world actually saw. But even as the fantasy formed, it felt hollow. Money could solve his problems, yes, but it couldn't undo what had been done to him, couldn't heal the fractures in his mind or bring back the years he'd lost to survival. And taking this fortune for himself, hoarding it, hiding it, spending it, felt like becoming exactly the kind of person he'd spent his whole life fighting against. No. If Colonel Hayes was right, if this money was meant for emergencies, for moments when everything else had failed, then Marcus knew what he had to do. He just didn't know how. He was still sitting on the crate, lost in thought, when he heard the sound. Footsteps. Faint but unmistakable, echoing through the concrete corridors. Marcus was on his feet instantly, his soldier's instincts snapping back to life despite years of dormancy. He grabbed a length of pipe from the floor, the only weapon available, and pressed himself against the vault door, listening. The footsteps grew closer. Whoever it was moved slowly, carefully, as if they knew the terrain. Then a voice called out, thin and wavering but unmistakably human. "Hello? Is someone there?" A woman's voice, old by the sound of it, and afraid. Marcus hesitated. He could stay hidden, could wait until whoever it was gave up and left. But something in that voice tugged at him, a vulnerability that reminded him of his own. He stepped out of the vault and into the corridor. "Over here," he called back. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, faster now. A moment later, a figure appeared at the end of the passage, a small, elderly woman wrapped in a heavy coat, her white hair escaping from beneath a wool cap. She held a flashlight in one hand and a photograph in the other. When she saw Marcus, she stopped. Her eyes went wide, but she didn't run. Instead, she took a long, careful look at him, his ragged clothes, his hollow cheeks, the military dog tags still hanging around his neck, and let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "You're not them," she said quietly. Marcus frowned. "Not who?" The woman shook her head. "Doesn't matter. What matters is you're here." She stepped closer, her eyes moving past him to the open vault. "You found it. After all these years, someone finally found it. You know about this place?" She nodded slowly. "My father built it. Well, not built, but he was the one who kept it alive, kept it hidden, kept it safe." She paused. "My name is Elaine Hayes, and I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Elaine Hayes looked nothing like a guardian of secrets. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with hands that trembled slightly as she clutched the photograph against her chest. Her face was lined with decades of waiting, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from carrying knowledge too heavy to share. Marcus lowered the pipe, but didn't drop it entirely. Trust, he had learned, was a luxury the streets didn't allow. "Your father was Colonel Hayes," he said slowly. "The one who wrote the letter?" Elaine's breath caught. "You found the letter?" "I found everything." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The vault hummed with silence behind them, its treasures glinting in the emergency lights. Then Elaine's shoulders sagged, and she looked suddenly older than her years. "I was hoping someone would," she whispered. "I've been coming here for decades, checking on the place, making sure nobody stumbled in before the right person came along. But I never had the courage to go inside. Never had the courage to decide what should be done." "Why not?" She met his eyes directly. "Because I knew what this place could do. The good it could bring, yes, but also the greed it could attract. My father spent his final years tormented by that choice. Should he report it and watch the money disappear into the pockets of politicians? Should he take it and become the very thing he despised? In the end, he chose to wait. And then he ran out of time." Marcus thought of the letter again. Use it for those the system forgot. "How did you know I was here?" Elaine smiled faintly. "I didn't, not for certain. But the storm last night was the worst we've had in 40 years. I came at dawn to check for damage and found the door open. When I saw the footprints in the snow leading inside, I prayed. I prayed that whoever had found this place was someone who would understand." "Understand what?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "That some secrets are meant to be kept until they're needed. That some treasures aren't meant to be hoarded, but released at exactly the right moment." She looked past him to the vault. "And that $300 million can either corrupt a soul or save 1,000 of them, depending on whose hands hold it." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle onto his shoulders. 300 million. He had guessed the value was enormous, but hearing the number spoken aloud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm homeless," he said bluntly. "I've been sleeping under bridges for 1.5 years. The VA forgot about me. My wife left, and the only reason I'm alive right now is because I remembered some old stories about a bunker in the hills." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not exactly the kind of person people trust with $300 million. Elaine studied him for a long moment. Then she held up the photograph she'd been clutching. It showed a young man in uniform standing proudly beside an American flag. The face was familiar, the same jaw, the same eyes Marcus saw in the mirror on the rare occasions he looked. "My father served in Korea," she said. "Came home with medals on his chest and screaming in his head. The country called him a hero and then left him to figure out the rest on his own. Sound familiar?" Marcus said nothing. "He spent years fighting demons nobody else could see. My mother almost left twice. I grew up watching him struggle to find a place in a world that didn't know what to do with broken soldiers." Elaine's voice cracked. He never stopped believing he could make it right, and when they gave him this assignment, this impossible secret assignment, he saw it as his chance, his purpose. She pressed the photograph into Marcus's hands. "He would have seen himself in you, and I think that's exactly why you're the one who found it." Marcus stared at the young colonel's face, the pride, the hope, the same look he'd worn in his own service photos, before the sand and the blood and the endless nights. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he asked quietly. Elaine shook her head. "I can't tell you that. I spent 30 years avoiding this moment because I didn't have the answer." She paused. "But I can tell you what my father believed. He believed that money sitting in a vault helps no one, and he believed that somewhere out there was a person brave enough to put it to work." "Brave or stupid?" she smiled. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Marcus turned back to the vault. The gold gleamed. The cash waited. The fortune that could change everything sat patient and still, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He thought of the tent city, of Pete and Maria and her son, of all the invisible men and women scattered across the country, sleeping in shadows, dying in storms nobody noticed. He thought of the shelters that never had enough beds, the programs that never had enough funding, the veterans who fell through cracks so wide you could lose a whole generation in them. And then he thought of Colonel Hayes waiting in the dark for a future he would never see. Marcus took a deep breath. "I'm going to need help," he said finally. "I don't know anything about money or foundations or legal whatever, but I know people, soldiers like me, brothers and sisters who got thrown away. If this is going to mean anything, they need to be part of it." Elaine's eyes glistened. "Then I suggest you start making calls." Marcus looked at the dog tags in his hand, Colonel Hayes on one side, his own name on the other. Two soldiers, separated by decades, connected by the system that had failed them both. He didn't know if he was brave or stupid, probably both. But for the first time in 3 years, he knew something else with absolute certainty. He wasn't invisible anymore, and before this was over, neither would anyone else the world had forgotten. The days that followed blurred together in ways Marcus hadn't experienced since his time in the service. There was purpose now, direction, something to wake up for besides the simple act of survival. Elaine had offered him a room in her small farmhouse just down the hill from the bunker, and for the first time in 18 months, he slept in an actual bed with clean sheets and a roof that didn't leak. But comfort brought its own challenges. The nightmares came harder when his body wasn't exhausted from cold and hunger. He woke more than once, drenched in sweat, the echo of explosions still ringing in his ears, his hands gripping the sheets like they were the edges of a crater. Elaine never mentioned the sounds that must have carried through the thin walls. She simply left coffee brewing each morning and gave him the space to pull himself together. They spent hours in the bunker, cataloguing everything. Marcus's engineering training proved useful. He understood the organizational logic behind the storage system, could read the military shorthand on the crate labels, recognized the classification codes that told him which documents were merely sensitive and which were dangerous. The full inventory took nearly a week to complete. When they finished, Marcus sat at Colonel Hayes's old desk and stared at the numbers he'd written on a legal pad Elaine had brought from town. Gold bullion, £27,400, estimated value $187 million at current market prices. bearer bonds, 43 million face value, though many had matured decades ago and were worth significantly more. Currency reserves, 12 million in cash, plus another 18 million in rare coins that collectors would fight over. Miscellaneous assets, artwork, jewelry, and other valuables seized during various government operations estimated at 40 million. The total exceeded $300 million. And none of it, as far as Marcus could determine, officially existed anymore. The program was called Operation Continuity, Elaine explained one evening as they sat in her kitchen, warming their hands on mugs of tea. My father talked about it near the end, when he knew he wasn't going to recover. He said it started during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when everyone in Washington genuinely believed the world might end within hours. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd read about those 13 days in October of 1962 when the United States and Soviet Union had come closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. The fear must have been overwhelming, the certainty that everything could vanish in a flash of light and a cloud of ash. They built 12 facilities, Elaine continued, scattered them along the East Coast, each one designed to function independently if the others were destroyed. The idea was that even if Washington was vaporized, the government could rebuild from these hidden reserves, money to restart the economy, supplies to sustain survivors, communication equipment to reconnect whatever remained. But the war never came. No. And by the time people stopped expecting it, the program had been buried under so many layers of classification that nobody remembered it existed. My father was assigned to close this facility in 1973. He waited 30 years for someone to tell him how. Marcus thought about that. 3 decades of waiting for orders that never arrived. He understood that kind of limbo better than he wanted to admit. The military taught you to follow commands, to trust the chain of authority, to believe that someone above you knew what they were doing. When that chain broke, when the orders stopped coming, you were left floating in a void with no compass and no shore in sight. Why didn't he just report it himself? Marcus asked. Go to the Pentagon, the Treasury, someone with the authority to make a decision. Elaine's expression darkened. He tried, 3 times in the 1980s. Each time he was told the program didn't exist. The files had been destroyed or lost or reclassified under a different name. The people who had created Operation Continuity were dead or retired or suffering from dementia. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that $300 million had been sitting in a hole in Virginia for 20 years. So he gave up. No. Elaine shook her head firmly. He made a choice. He decided that if the system couldn't handle the truth, then the truth would have to wait for someone outside the system. She met Marcus's eyes. Someone like you. Marcus set down his mug and stared at his hands. The calluses were still there, built up over years of hard work, but they looked different to him now. Not the hands of a beggar or a vagrant, the hands of a man who had been given a responsibility he never asked for. I keep thinking about what he wrote, Marcus said quietly. Use it for those the system forgot. It sounds simple when you read it, but actually doing it. He trailed off, overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. Elaine reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. My father spent his whole life trying to serve his country, she said. And his country let him down, just like it let you down. But he never stopped believing that the uniform meant something. That sacrifice deserved to be honored. Her grip tightened. If you're asking me what I think you should do, the answer is simple. Don't let his faith be wasted. Don't let yours be wasted either. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling, running through possibilities in his mind. He could turn the vault over to the government, but Elaine's father had already proven that path led nowhere. He could take the money and disappear, but that felt like betrayal, both of Colonel Hayes's trust and his own tattered sense of honor. He could try to use it himself, funding some kind of charitable effort, But he had no idea how to manage that kind of wealth. No connections, no infrastructure, nothing but good intentions and a lifetime of training in explosives rather than economics. And then, somewhere around 3 in the morning, he remembered something. A name, a face, a debt that had never been repaid. Danny Cortez. They had served together in Afghanistan, back before the IED changed everything. Danny had been a combat medic, one of the best Marcus had ever seen, the kind of guy who could keep a man alive with nothing but duct tape, prayer, and sheer stubbornness. After his discharge, Danny had tried to start a shelter for homeless veterans in Baltimore. The last Marcus had heard, it was struggling to stay open, starved of funding while the men it served slept in its hallways for lack of proper beds. Marcus sat up in bed. His heart was pounding, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. The next morning, he asked Elaine if he could use her phone. Finding Danny wasn't easy. The shelter's website was outdated, its contact form broken. Marcus spent hours tracking down alternative numbers, leaving messages with people who promised to pass along his name. When Danny finally called back 3 days later, his voice was thick with exhaustion. "Marcus Reeves? Brother, I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Marcus replied, though the world did its best. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Danny's situation was even worse than Marcus had feared. The shelter was 3 months behind on rent, its heating system had failed, and the city was threatening to shut it down for code violations. Danny had been working 20-hour days, begging churches and businesses for donations, but the money was never enough. The veterans kept coming, and the doors kept barely staying open. "I'm running out of miracles," Danny admitted. "I've got 47 guys depending on me right now. If we close, most of them end up back on the streets. Some of them won't survive another winter." Marcus closed his eyes. 47 men, 47 stories just like his own. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that I might have found a way to help?" The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "I'd say you've either lost your mind or found God," Danny finally replied. "Which is it?" "Maybe both. But I'm serious. I need you to come to Virginia. There's something I have to show you." Danny arrived 4 days later, driving a battered van that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. When he stepped out and saw Marcus standing in Elaine's driveway, his face went through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat: shock, joy, concern, confusion, before settling into something that might have been awe. "Holy hell," Danny breathed. "You look like you've been through a war." "2 of them," Marcus replied. "But who's counting?" They embraced, 2 soldiers reunited after years of silence, holding on longer than either would have admitted. When they finally separated, Danny's eyes were wet. "They told me you'd fallen off the grid," he said. "After your discharge, after the divorce, people said you'd given up. I should have looked harder. I should have—" "Don't," Marcus cut him off. "You were busy saving lives. That's what medics do." They walked to the bunker together, Marcus explaining what he'd found as they went. Danny listened in silence, his expression growing more incredulous with every word. When they finally descended into the vault and he saw the gold gleaming under the lights, he sank to his knees. "This can't be real," he whispered. "This has to be some kind of fever dream." "It's real," Marcus assured him, "and it's been sitting here for 50 years, waiting for someone to put it to use." Danny stood slowly, turning in a circle, taking in the scope of what surrounded him. "Marcus, do you have any idea how many people this could help? How many lives we could save?" "That's exactly what I've been thinking." They spent the next several hours talking through possibilities. Elaine joined them, bringing sandwiches and coffee, listening as the 2 veterans mapped out a vision that grew larger with every passing minute. They talked about shelters, not just Danny's, but dozens of them across the country. They talked about medical clinics and job training programs and mental health services. They talked about everything the VA had failed to provide and everything the government had promised but never delivered. But they also talked about obstacles, about the legal complications of using money that technically didn't exist, about the attention such efforts would attract, about the powerful people who might prefer this treasure stay buried forever. "We need a lawyer," Danny said finally. "Someone who understands this kind of thing. Someone who can figure out how to make this legitimate without getting us all thrown in prison." Marcus nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing, and he knew exactly who to call. Rosa Mendez had been a JAG lawyer in the army, one of the few people Marcus had trusted during his years in uniform. She'd fought for soldiers when the system wanted to chew them up and spit them out, won cases that everyone said were unwinnable, built a reputation as someone who believed justice wasn't just a word in a manual. After her discharge, she'd started a non-profit focused on veterans' legal rights. If anyone could navigate the minefield they were about to enter, it was her. The call to Rosa went better than Marcus had dared hope. She was skeptical at first. Who wouldn't be? But something in his voice convinced her to make the trip. She arrived 2 weeks later, driving a sensible sedan and carrying a briefcase full of legal texts. When she saw the vault, she didn't pray or cry or sink to her knees. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "This is unprecedented," she said, her voice calm but her eyes blazing with intensity. "The legal implications alone could fill a dozen textbooks, but that doesn't mean it's impossible." "Can we use it?" Marcus asked. "Can we actually help people with this money without ending up in federal prison?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her since she'd arrived. "I'm going to need to do some research," she said. "But I think there's a path, a narrow one, full of pitfalls and potential disasters, but a path." She looked at Marcus with something like respect. "You've stumbled into something extraordinary here. The question is whether you're brave enough to see it through." Marcus thought about the bridges he'd slept under, the meals he'd scrounged from dumpsters, the looks of disgust from people who saw his cardboard sign and crossed to the other side of the street. "Brave's got nothing to do with it," he said quietly. "This is the mission now, and soldiers don't abandon their missions." What happens next will test everything Marcus has rebuilt, threaten everything he's found, and prove that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth. Stay tuned to see what unfolds. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The word spread faster than Marcus had anticipated. He'd called one more person from his past, Hank Morrison, a grizzled master sergeant who had saved his life during that final mission in Kandahar. Hank had been the one who dragged him from the burning crater, the one who kept pressure on the wounds until the medics arrived, the one who visited him in the hospital when almost nobody else did. If there was anyone in the world Marcus trusted completely, it was Hank. Hank arrived in a pickup truck held together by rust and determination. He was older now, his hair gone grey, his limp more pronounced from an injury he'd sustained in his final deployment. But his eyes still held that same fierce intensity, that same refusal to accept defeat. When he saw what Marcus had found, Hank didn't celebrate. He went quiet, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You know what this means," he said finally. Marcus nodded. "Trouble. More than trouble." Hank turned to face him directly. "Money like this doesn't stay hidden forever. People talk. Word gets out. And when it does, you're going to have every kind of vulture imaginable circling overhead. Government types who want to reclaim it. Criminals who want to steal it. And politicians who want to make sure it never sees the light of day. I know the risks." "Do you?" Hank's voice was sharp. "Because I've seen what happens to men who threaten powerful interests. They don't just disappear. They get destroyed first, their reputations, their families, their lives. Are you ready for that?" Marcus thought about the question. Really thought about it. What did he have left to lose? His reputation was already in ruins. His family was gone. His life had been reduced to sleeping in tents and eating scraps. If anything, he was the perfect person for this fight. Someone with nothing left to protect and everything to gain. "I'm ready," he said. Hank stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face. "Good," he said, "because I didn't come here to talk you out of it. I came here to help." The team took shape over the following weeks. Danny would handle the operational side, using his experience with the shelter to design programs that actually worked. Rosa would navigate the legal labyrinth, finding ways to legitimize the money without triggering investigations that could shut everything down. Hank would provide security and logistics, drawing on his decades of military experience to anticipate threats before they materialized. And Elaine, despite her age, insisted on being part of everything. She was the connection to her father's legacy, the keeper of secrets that might still prove valuable. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, not because he sought leadership, but because the others looked to him naturally. He was the one who had found the vault. He was the one who had made the choice to use it for good. And he was the one whose story, homeless veteran discovers forgotten fortune, would eventually become the face of everything they built. But for now, they worked in secret. Rosa had advised them to move slowly, to establish legal frameworks before taking any public action. They spent weeks researching abandoned property laws, obscure military regulations, and the Byzantine processes by which unclaimed government assets could be petitioned for civilian use. It was painstaking work. There were moments when Marcus wanted to simply start handing out money to every veteran he could find, consequences be damned. But Rosa kept him grounded, reminding him that hasty action could undermine everything they hoped to achieve. "We get one shot at this," she said during one late-night strategy session. "If we move too fast and the government seizes the assets, it all disappears into the same bureaucracy that lost it in the first place. We have to be smart. We have to be patient. We have to build something that can't be torn down." Marcus nodded, accepting the wisdom even as frustration burned in his chest. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It started with a small mistake, one of those tiny errors that ripples outward into catastrophe. Marcus had needed supplies for the bunker, batteries for the emergency lights, cleaning materials for the vault, basic provisions to sustain the team during their long hours of work. He'd driven into town with cash from the vault, a bundle of $100 bills he hadn't thought twice about. But the bills were old, dated from the 1960s, their serial numbers part of a sequence that had been discontinued decades ago. The hardware store clerk noticed, then the diner owner noticed, then the owner of the antique shop noticed. Within a week, rumors were swirling through the small town. Someone had found old money. A lot of old money. The kind of money that didn't just appear out of nowhere. Marcus first realized something was wrong when he noticed a black SUV parked on the road below Elaine's farmhouse. It sat there for hours, its windows tinted, its occupants invisible. The next day, there were two of them. "We've got a problem," Hank said, his voice grim. He'd spotted the vehicles during a perimeter check, had noted the government plates, had recognized the posture of men who were watching and waiting. "How bad?" Marcus asked. Hank's expression told him everything he needed to know. "Bad enough that we need to start thinking about contingencies. Bad enough that someone with power has taken an interest in what you found." He paused. "And bad enough that I don't think they're going to let you keep it without a fight." Marcus looked out the window at the distant bunker, hidden beneath the hill that had protected it for half a century. He thought about Colonel Hayes, waiting in that same darkness, hoping for someone brave enough to finish what he started. The fight was coming, ready or not. The black SUVs multiplied over the following days, first 2, then 4, then 6. They rotated positions, never staying in one place long enough to seem permanent, but always present, always watching. Marcus counted them during his morning walks around the property, noting the patterns, the shift changes, the moments when one vehicle would pull away and another would take its place. Whoever was behind this surveillance had resources, serious resources, the kind that came with government budgets or corporate wealth or both. "They're not hiding anymore," Hank observed one evening, standing at the window with binoculars pressed to his eyes. "That's deliberate. They want us to know we're being watched, want us to feel the pressure." "Any idea who they are?" Danny asked. He'd been pacing the living room for the past hour, his nervous energy filling the small space like static electricity. Hank lowered the binoculars. "Could be federal, Treasury maybe, or some branch of Homeland Security nobody's ever heard of. Could be private contractors working for someone with deep pockets. Could be both." He turned to face the group. "What I know for certain is that they're professionals. Military training, by the look of their movements, and they're not going away." Rosa had been quiet, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table, scrolling through legal databases with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Now she looked up, her face pale in the glow of the screen. "I think I found something," she said, "and it's not good." The others gathered around as she turned the laptop toward them. On the screen was a scanned document, its edges yellowed with age, bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. "This is a memorandum from 1974, Rosa explained. 1 year after Colonel Hayes was assigned to close the facility. It's addressed to someone in the Pentagon's budget office, and it references Operation Continuity by name." Marcus leaned closer, squinting at the faded text. "What does it say?" "It says that the program was officially terminated and all assets were to be recovered and reintegrated into the General Treasury." Rosa paused, her finger hovering over a specific paragraph. "But here's the interesting part. There's a handwritten note in the margin. Someone wrote, 'Exception granted. Hayes facility, pending further review.' And then nothing. No follow-up, no further documentation, just that single note, and then silence for 50 years. "So they knew," Elaine said softly. "Someone in the government knew my father was still guarding that vault." "Not just knew," Rosa corrected. "Authorized. Someone with enough authority to override the termination order deliberately left your father in place. The question is why." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a case of bureaucratic neglect or lost paperwork. Someone had made a conscious decision to keep the vault hidden, to leave Colonel Hayes as its guardian, to ensure that $300 million remained buried in the Virginia hills. "Maybe they were waiting," Marcus said slowly, thinking out loud. "Waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right crisis. Or the right opportunity," Hank added grimly. "Money like that doesn't just sit around by accident. Someone had plans for it, and now that you've found it, those plans are probably falling apart." Rosa closed the laptop and rubbed her temples. "This changes things. If there's an official exception on record, then the assets aren't technically abandoned. They're still under some kind of governmental oversight, even if that oversight has been dormant for decades." She looked at Marcus. "That makes our legal path a lot more complicated." "How complicated?" "Complicated enough that we might be fighting people who have the law on their side, at least on paper." Marcus absorbed this information, feeling the weight of it settle onto his shoulders. He'd known from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated fighting an enemy that could claim legitimacy, that could use the very system he'd once served to crush everything he was trying to build. "So what do we do?" Danny asked, his voice strained. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of his team. Danny, who had spent years saving lives with nothing but determination and duct tape. Rosa, who had fought for justice when nobody else would. Hank, who had pulled him from a burning crater and refused to leave him behind. And Elaine, the keeper of her father's legacy, the woman who had waited decades for someone to finish what Colonel Hayes started. These were his people now, his unit, and he wasn't going to let them down. "We keep going," he said quietly. "We document everything. We build our case. And when they come for us, because they will, we make sure the whole world is watching. The first direct contact came 3 days later. Marcus was alone in the bunker, organizing files in the vault, when he heard footsteps in the corridor above. Not Elaine's careful shuffle or Hank's heavy tread. These footsteps were confident, measured, the sound of someone who expected to be obeyed. He grabbed the flashlight and climbed the stairs, his heart pounding but his hands steady. Years of combat training didn't disappear just because the battlefield had changed. The man waiting in the operations room was tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than everything Marcus had owned in his entire life. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, the eyes of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Sergeant Marcus Reeves," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Or should I say Mr. Reeves now? I understand you've had some difficulties since your discharge." Marcus said nothing, just watched and waited. The man smiled thinly. "My name is Victor Ashford. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring this situation with considerable attention." He gestured around at the dusty equipment, the faded posters, the relics of a Cold War that had ended before Marcus was born. "Quite a discovery you've made here. Quite a discovery indeed." "How did you get in?" "The door was open." Victor's smile widened slightly. "I took that as an invitation." Marcus made a mental note to reinforce the security protocols. "What do you want?" "Straight to business. I appreciate that." Victor reached into his jacket and produced a slim envelope, which he placed on a nearby desk. "Inside that envelope is a cashier's check for $50 million. It's yours, free and clear, no questions asked. All you have to do is walk away." Marcus stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "Walk away from what?" "From this facility, from whatever you found inside it, from whatever plans you're making with your little band of fellow veterans." Victor's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Take the money, Mr. Reeves. Start a new life. Buy a house. Get proper medical care. Reconnect with that ex-wife of yours. $50 million can make a lot of problems disappear." "And if I don't?" Victor's smile faded. "Then different problems appear, the kind that can't be solved with money." He paused, letting the threat settle into the silence. "You're a smart man. You've seen how the world works. You know that people with resources can make life very difficult for people without them. And right now, Mr. Reeves, you have nothing. No home, no family, no protection. Just a crumbling bunker full of secrets that powerful people would prefer stay buried." Marcus felt the old anger rising in his chest, the same anger that had gotten him through 18 months on the streets, the same anger that had kept him alive when everything else was trying to kill him. But he pushed it down, forced himself to think clearly. "Who are you really?" he asked. "Who sent you?" Victor's expression flickered, just for an instant, before the mask slid back into place. "That's not information you need. What you need to understand is that this offer has a time limit, 48 hours. After that, the check is void, and our next conversation will be considerably less pleasant." He turned and walked toward the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. "Think carefully, Mr. Reeves. $50 million is a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to what you'll lose if you make the wrong choice." Then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the bunker that had kept secrets for half a century. Marcus stood alone in the operations room for a long time after Victor left. He stared at the envelope on the desk, at the check inside that represented more money than he'd ever seen, more than he'd ever imagined having. $50 million. Enough to solve every problem he'd ever faced, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, enough to make all the pain and struggle simply vanish. But as he stood there, images flashed through his mind. Pete, the old veteran from the tent city, wrapping himself in threadbare blankets to survive the winter. Maria and her son, huddled in a van that might run out of gas at any moment. The 47 men in Danny's shelter, depending on a building that was falling apart around them. All the invisible people he'd met during his months on the streets. Broken soldiers, forgotten heroes, men and women who had given everything and received nothing in return. $50 million for him. Nothing for them. Marcus picked up the envelope, turned it over in his hands, and then, without hesitation, tore it in half. He tore those halves into quarters, those quarters into eighths, until the check was nothing but confetti scattered across the dusty floor. When he returned to Elaine's farmhouse and told the others what had happened, the reactions varied. Danny looked terrified. Rosa looked calculating. Hank looked like he was already planning defensive positions. And Elaine, quiet Elaine, looked at Marcus with something that might have been pride. "You know what this means," Hank said. "They're not going to let this go. That was the carrot. Now comes the stick." "Let them come," Marcus replied. "We knew this was going to get ugly." "Ugly is one thing. Dangerous is another." Hank moved to the window, scanning the road below. "We need to fortify this position, establish perimeters, create fallback points." "This isn't a war zone," Danny protested. Hank turned to face him, his expression grim. "Yes, it is. You just haven't realized it yet." Over the next week, the farmhouse transformed. Hank directed the installation of security cameras at every approach, motion sensors along the tree line, reinforced locks on every door and window. He mapped escape routes through the woods, identified safe houses in neighboring towns, established communication protocols in case they were separated. Marcus found himself slipping back into old patterns, his military training reasserting itself after years of dormancy. He helped Hank dig defensive positions around the bunker entrance, created hidden caches of supplies in the surrounding forest, practiced emergency procedures until they became second nature. But even as they prepared for physical confrontation, Rosa was fighting a different battle. She spent 18 hours a day researching legal precedents, drafting motions, building a case that could withstand the kind of pressure they were about to face. "I found something," she announced one morning, her eyes red from lack of sleep but blazing with excitement. "A loophole, small but potentially significant." The others gathered around as she explained. There was an obscure provision in military law dating back to the 1950s that governed the disposition of abandoned governmental assets. If an asset had been left unclaimed for 50 years or more, and if the original authorization for its existence had been officially terminated, then any civilian who discovered and documented the asset could petition for ownership under something called the Abandoned Federal Property Act. "The key is that termination order from 1974, Rosa continued. "Operation continuity was officially ended. The assets were supposed to be recovered. The fact that someone wrote an exception in the margin doesn't change the legal status of the termination. It just means someone chose not to enforce it." "So technically the vault has been abandoned for 50 years?" Marcus asked. "Technically, yes. The exception was never formalized, never entered into any official record. It's just a handwritten note on a memo that probably should have been shredded decades ago." Rosa smiled grimly. "Which means, if we can prove that the assets have been genuinely unclaimed for half a century, we might have a legitimate legal claim." "Might?" "The law is complicated. There will be challenges, appeals, counter-motions, but it's a path, a narrow one, like I said before, but a path." The first real attack came 3 nights later. Marcus was asleep in the guest room when the sound of breaking glass snapped him awake. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the flashlight and the metal pipe he kept beside the bed. Footsteps pounded somewhere below, multiple people moving fast. He met Hank in the hallway. The older man was fully dressed, as if he'd been expecting trouble, a hunting rifle in his hands. "How many?" Marcus whispered. "At least 4. They came through the kitchen window." They moved together toward the stairs, years of shared training making words unnecessary. Below, shadows flickered in the dim light, figures moving through the living room toward the back of the house where Elaine slept. Marcus didn't hesitate. He descended the stairs 2 at a time, swinging the pipe at the first figure he encountered. The impact was solid, satisfying, and the intruder crumpled with a grunt of pain. Behind him, Hank's rifle cracked twice, and 2 more figures scattered for cover. The fight was brief but brutal. The intruders were professionals, but Marcus and Hank were veterans of a different kind of warfare, close quarters, desperate, survival-driven. Within minutes, 3 of the attackers were down, and the 4th was fleeing through the broken window into the night. When it was over, Marcus stood in the wrecked living room, breathing hard, his hands trembling with adrenaline. Danny had appeared from somewhere, a baseball bat in his grip, looking shaken but unharmed. And Elaine. "Where's Elaine?" Marcus demanded. They found her in her bedroom, sitting calmly in a chair by the window, a small pistol in her lap. She looked up as they entered, her expression serene. "I heard the commotion," she said simply. "I thought it best to be prepared." Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're okay?" "I'm fine. Are they gone?" "For now." Elaine nodded slowly, then looked down at the pistol in her hands. "My father gave this to me 40 years ago, told me to keep it close, just in case." She met Marcus's eyes. "I never thought I'd actually need it." They didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Instead, they gathered in the kitchen, cleaning wounds, drinking coffee, and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The intruders had left behind little evidence. No identification, no distinguishing marks on their tactical gear, nothing that could trace them back to whoever had sent them. Professionals, just as Hank had predicted. "This was a warning," Hank said, pressing a bag of frozen peas against a bruise on his jaw. "They could have come in with more force, could have brought weapons we couldn't match, but they didn't. They wanted to scare us." "It worked," Danny admitted, his voice shaky. "Fear is a tool," Marcus replied. "They use it because it's cheaper than fighting, but it only works if we let it." Rosa had been on her phone for the past hour, speaking in urgent whispers with someone on the other end. Now she hung up and turned to face the group. "I just talked to a contact at the Justice Department, someone I trust. She says there's been unusual activity around certain classified files that match the time frame and description of Operation Continuity." She paused. "Whoever is behind this has connections at the highest levels. They've been pulling strings, trying to bury any trace of the program's existence." "Why now?" Marcus asked. "The vault has been sitting there for 50 years. Why suddenly care about it?" Rosa's expression was grim. "Because you found it, because you're not playing by their rules, and because they're terrified of what happens if the truth gets out." The next few weeks were a blur of legal filings, security upgrades, and sleepless nights. Rosa pushed forward with her petition, filing documents that would establish Marcus's claim to the vault under the Abandoned Federal Property Act. The process was slow, grinding, full of setbacks and small victories that felt meaningless in the moment. But something else was happening too. Word was spreading. It started with a reporter from a small regional newspaper who somehow caught wind of the story. She showed up at the farmhouse one morning, notebook in hand, asking questions about the mysterious bunker in the hills and the homeless veteran who had found it. Marcus refused to speak with her, but the damage was done. Within days, the story had jumped to larger outlets, local news stations, then national blogs, then the kind of cable networks that thrived on controversy and conspiracy. "Homeless veteran discovers secret government vault worth $300 million, the headline screamed. "Cold War treasure trove found by Man Society forgot." The coverage was sensational, often inaccurate, but it accomplished something that Marcus hadn't anticipated. It made them visible. Suddenly, the black SUVs couldn't lurk in the shadows anymore. Camera crews camped at the edge of the property, filming every vehicle that came and went. Journalists interviewed townspeople, dug through public records, started asking uncomfortable questions about why such a massive asset had been allowed to remain hidden for so long. And then the public support began to flood in. Letters arrived by the hundreds, from veterans, from their families, from ordinary citizens who had read the story and felt moved to respond. Some sent money, small bills stuffed into envelopes with notes of encouragement. Others sent prayers, photographs, stories of their own struggles with a system that had failed them. "You're not alone," one letter read. "We're watching. We're with you. Don't give up." Marcus sat in Elaine's kitchen, surrounded by stacks of mail he hadn't yet opened, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. But hope, he knew, was dangerous. It made you vulnerable. It made you believe things could change when the world was determined to keep them exactly the same. He looked up as Rosa entered the room, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with something that looked almost like triumph. "We got a hearing date," she said. 3 weeks from now, federal court. The judge agreed to expedite based on the media attention and the unusual circumstances of the case. She allowed herself a small smile. "We're going to get our day in court." Marcus nodded slowly, processing the news. 3 weeks. 21 days to prepare for the most important battle of his life. A battle that wouldn't be fought with rifles or explosives, but with words, with evidence, with the power of a story that refused to stay buried. "What are our chances?" he asked. Rosa's smile faded slightly. "Honestly, I don't know. We're fighting people with unlimited resources and decades of experience manipulating the system. They'll throw everything they have at us." She paused. "But we have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth. And right now, thanks to all that media coverage, everyone in the country is watching to see what happens next." Marcus thought about Colonel Hayes, waiting in the darkness for a future he would never see. He thought about the letter, the words that had set everything in motion. Use it for those the system forgot. The system had forgotten them all. Marcus, Danny, Hank, the 47 men in the shelter, the thousands more suffering in silence across the country. But they weren't invisible anymore, and they weren't going to be forgotten again. "Then let's give them something worth watching," Marcus said. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to a system Marcus had once believed in without question. Its marble columns rose toward a gray winter sky, its steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps, people seeking justice, people fleeing injustice, people caught somewhere in between. Marcus climbed those steps on a Tuesday morning in early March, flanked by Rosa on one side and Hank on the other, with Danny and Elaine following close behind. Cameras flashed from every direction. Reporters shouted questions he couldn't process. Somewhere in the crowd, a group of veterans in worn jackets held signs that read, "We stand with Marcus and honor our heroes." He hadn't asked them to come. They'd organized themselves, spreading the word through Facebook groups and veteran forums, driving from as far as Ohio and North Carolina to be present for this moment. The sight of them made his throat tighten. Inside, the courthouse was quieter but no less intense. Security officers checked credentials and scanned bags. Lawyers in expensive suits clustered in corners, speaking in hushed tones. And everywhere Marcus looked, he saw the machinery of a system that had chewed him up and spit him out. The same system that would now decide whether his discovery meant freedom or destruction. The courtroom itself was smaller than he'd expected, wood-paneled and solemn, with rows of benches already filling with spectators and press. At the front, 2 tables faced the judge's bench, one for Marcus and his team, one for the opposition. And what an opposition it was! Victor Ashford sat at the other table, surrounded by a phalanx of attorneys whose suits alone probably cost more than everything Marcus had owned before finding the vault. Behind them sat representatives from various government agencies, Treasury, Defense, Homeland Security, their faces carefully blank but their presence unmistakably threatening. Rosa leaned close to Marcus as they took their seats. "Whatever happens in there, Remember why we're doing this. Remember who we're fighting for." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. "I remember." The Honourable Margaret Chen entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her robes flowing behind her as she took her seat. She was older than Marcus had expected, her hair silver, her face lined with decades of difficult decisions. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, the eyes of someone who had seen every trick in the legal playbook and wasn't impressed by any of them. "We are here today," she began, her voice carrying easily through the silent room, "to consider a petition filed under the Abandoned Federal Property Act of 1953. The petitioner, Mr. Marcus Reeves, claims discovery and rightful ownership of assets located in a decommissioned military facility in rural Virginia. The respondents, representing various federal agencies, contest this claim." She looked down at the papers before her, then back up at the assembled parties. "I have reviewed the briefs submitted by both sides, I have examined the evidence, and I have a number of questions that I expect to be answered before we proceed." Her gaze settled on the government's table. "Let's start with the obvious one. Why exactly has $300 million in federal assets been sitting in a hole in Virginia for the past 50 years? The lead attorney for the government, a polished man named Harrison Wells, rose smoothly to his feet. "Your Honor, the assets in question were part of a classified program that was terminated in 1974. The failure to recover those assets was an administrative oversight, compounded by the sensitive nature of the program and the loss of institutional knowledge over time." "An administrative oversight," Judge Chen repeated, her tone flat. $300 million, forgotten for half a century, and you're calling it an administrative oversight." Wells shifted slightly, the first crack in his composure. "The circumstances were unusual, Your Honor. The Cold War created many such situations. Programs that were classified beyond normal parameters, facilities that were deliberately obscured from standard record-keeping. When the threat environment changed, some of these programs simply fell through the cracks." Fell through the cracks. The judge made a note on her pad. And yet, according to the documents submitted by the petitioner, there was a handwritten exception granted for this specific facility. Someone, at some point, made a deliberate decision to leave it in place. "Can you explain that?" Wells hesitated. Marcus watched his face carefully, saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. Whatever answer he gave next would either support the government's case or undermine it. "We have been unable to identify the individual who wrote that exception," Wells finally admitted. "The personnel records from that era are incomplete. However, we maintain that the exception, whatever its origin, does not alter the fundamental legal status of the assets. They remain federal property, subject to federal control." Rosa rose to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may?" Judge Chen nodded. "Proceed, Counselor." "The government's position rests on the assumption that the exception somehow preserved federal ownership of the assets. But the Abandoned Federal Property Act is clear on this point. Once an asset has been officially terminated, as Operation Continuity was in 1974, any informal arrangement to maintain it becomes legally meaningless. The assets reverted to abandoned status the moment the termination order was signed." She stepped forward, holding up a thick folder of documents. "We have submitted extensive evidence showing that no formal action was ever taken to preserve federal ownership of this facility or its contents. No budget allocations, no personnel assignments, no maintenance contracts. For 50 years, the government treated these assets as if they didn't exist. And under the law, when the government abandons property for that length of time, it loses the right to suddenly reclaim it." Wells was on his feet immediately. That interpretation ignores the classified nature of the program. The government cannot be expected to maintain public records of assets that were deliberately hidden for national security reasons. "Then perhaps the government shouldn't be surprised when those assets slip away," Rosa countered. "You can't have it both ways. Either the facility was part of an ongoing federal program, in which case there should be documentation proving continued ownership, or it was abandoned. There is no middle ground. The arguments continued for hours. Witnesses were called, documents were entered into evidence, legal precedents were cited and contested. Marcus sat through all of it, trying to follow the complex threads of argument and counter-argument, feeling increasingly like a spectator in his own story. But then, near the end of the first day, something shifted. Rosa called Elaine Hayes to the stand. The old woman walked slowly to the witness box, her steps careful but her bearing dignified. She wore a simple blue dress, her white hair pinned back from her face, her hands steady despite her age. When she took her seat, she looked directly at the judge with eyes that had seen 8 decades of history unfold. "Mrs. Hayes," Rosa began gently, "can you tell the court about your father, Colonel Edward Hayes?" Elaine nodded. "My father was a soldier. He served in Korea, came home with medals and nightmares, spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of both. In 1973, he was assigned to close a facility in the Virginia Hills. A facility that contained, well, you know what it contained. And what happened when he tried to complete that assignment?" "Nothing." Elaine's voice was soft but clear. "He filed the paperwork, he followed the protocols, and then he waited. For months, for years, for decades. No one ever came. No one ever told him what to do with what he'd been ordered to guard. So he kept guarding it. He had no choice. My father was a man of duty. When the army gave him an assignment, he saw it through, even when the army forgot about him." Her voice cracked slightly. "He spent the last 30 years of his life watching over that vault, waiting for orders that never came. It broke him in the end, but he never abandoned his post." Rosa let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. "Mrs. Hayes, do you believe your father would have wanted the assets in that vault to remain hidden forever?" Elaine shook her head firmly. "No, he wrote a letter. You've seen it. He hoped that someday someone would find what he had protected and use it for good. Use it for the people the system had forgotten." She looked at Marcus, her eyes glistening. People like the young man who found it. People who had given everything and received nothing in return. Wells rose to cross-examine, but his questions seemed hollow after Elaine's testimony. He asked about her father's mental state in his final years, suggested that his judgment might have been compromised, implied that his letter was the rambling of a confused old man. But Elaine answered each challenge with quiet dignity, never losing her composure, never backing down from the truth of what she had witnessed. By the time she stepped down from the stand, Marcus could see that something in the room had changed. The judge's expression was thoughtful. The spectators were leaning forward. Even some of the government attorneys looked uncomfortable. The trial continued for 3 more days. Rosa built her case methodically, establishing the legal framework for abandonment, demonstrating the government's failure to maintain any meaningful connection to the assets, and painting a picture of bureaucratic negligence that had allowed $300 million to simply vanish from the ledger. The government fought back, of course. They brought in experts on national security, argued that classified programs required different standards of accountability, suggested that allowing civilians to claim abandoned military assets would set a dangerous precedent. But their arguments felt increasingly desperate, their tone increasingly defensive. On the final day of testimony, Rosa called her last witness, Marcus himself. He walked to the stand feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The cameras, the reporters, the veterans who had come to support him, the government officials who wanted to see him fail. They all watched as he settled into the chair and raised his right hand to take the oath. Rosa approached slowly, giving him time to collect himself. "Mr. Reeves, can you tell the court how you came to discover the facility in question?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I was homeless. Had been for about 18 months. living in a tent city outside town, scraping by however I could. And then a storm came. Worst one in 40 years, they said. I knew my tent wouldn't survive it, so I remembered some old stories about a bunker in the hills, a place where I might find shelter. And you went looking for it? I did. Walked through the snow for hours, nearly froze to death twice. But I found it, broke through the doors, got inside just before the worst of the storm hit. He paused, remembering that night, the desperate hope that had driven him forward. I thought I was just looking for a place to survive the night. Turns out I found something a lot bigger. Rosa nodded. And when you discovered what was hidden inside that bunker, what was your first thought? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The courtroom waited. I thought about all the people I'd met on the streets, he finally said. Veterans like me, who'd served their country and been thrown away when they weren't useful anymore. Families living in cars. Kids who'd never known what it felt like to have a safe place to sleep. His voice grew stronger. And I thought, this is it. This is how we fix it, not just for me, but for all of them. So you never considered keeping the money for yourself? A man came to see me a few weeks after I found the vault. Offered me $50 million to walk away. Just take the money and disappear. Let them bury the truth again. Marcus shook his head. I tore up the check, because that money wasn't mine. It was meant for something bigger, and I wasn't going to let anyone steal that purpose. Not from Colonel Hayes, not from the people who need it, not from myself. Wells rose for cross-examination, his questions sharp and probing. He asked about Marcus's mental health, his history of homelessness, his qualifications to manage assets of such magnitude. He implied that Marcus was naive, that he was being manipulated by people with their own agendas, that his noble intentions would inevitably lead to waste and corruption. Marcus answered each question calmly, honestly, without defensiveness or anger. He admitted his limitations, acknowledged his struggles, but never wavered from his central conviction. This money belonged to those who had been forgotten, and he would fight to see it used for that purpose. When the cross-examination ended, Judge Chen dismissed the court until the following morning, when she would deliver her ruling. That night, none of them slept. They gathered in Elaine's farmhouse, the same kitchen where they had planned and strategized for months, drinking coffee and waiting for dawn. Hank stood watch at the window, old habits dying hard. Danny paced the floor, unable to sit still. Rosa reviewed her notes one final time, looking for anything she might have missed. And Elaine sat quietly in her rocking chair, her father's photograph in her hands. Marcus stepped outside just before sunrise. The air was cold and clean, carrying the first hints of spring beneath the lingering winter chill. He walked to the edge of the property and looked east, towards the hills where the bunker lay hidden. 50 years. That's how long Colonel Hayes had waited. And now, in just a few hours, everything would be decided. You're not alone, you know. He turned to find Elaine standing behind him, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her breath misting in the early morning air. I know, he said. I've got you all. Not just us. She moved to stand beside him, following his gaze toward the hills. My father believed that someday someone would come along who understood, someone who had been through enough darkness to recognize light when they found it. She placed her weathered hand on his arm. He was right to believe, and so are you. Marcus swallowed hard, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. What if we lose? Elaine smiled gently. Then we keep fighting. That's what soldiers do, isn't it? We don't stop just because the battle goes badly. We regroup, we adapt, we find another way. She squeezed his arm. But I don't think we're going to lose. Not today. The courtroom was packed when they returned. Every seat was filled with more people crowding the hallways outside, watching on screens that had been set up to handle the overflow. The air hummed with tension, with anticipation, with the collective held breath of everyone who understood what was at stake. Judge Chen entered precisely at 9, her face unreadable. She took her seat, arranged her papers, and looked out at the assembled crowd. "I have given considerable thought to this matter," she began. "The legal questions are complex, touching on issues of national security, property rights, governmental accountability, and the fundamental obligations we owe to those who serve our nation." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "The government argues that these assets remain federal property, regardless of how long they have been abandoned or neglected. They cite classified protocols, national security concerns, and the need to prevent civilians from claiming abandoned military resources." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Beside him, Rosa's hand gripped the edge of the table. "However," the judge continued, "the law is clear on the question of abandonment. When the federal government officially terminates a program and fails to take any meaningful action to preserve its assets for a period exceeding 50 years, those assets become subject to civilian claim under the Abandoned Federal Property Act." She looked directly at the government's table. The exception written in the margin of that 1974 memorandum, whatever its original intent, was never formalized through proper channels. It created no legal obligation, established no ongoing ownership, and cannot now be used to retroactively assert control over assets that the government chose to ignore for half a century. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear. "Furthermore," Judge Chen continued, "I find the petitioner's claim to be not only legally valid but morally compelling. Mr. Reeves discovered these assets through his own initiative, documented them properly, and has demonstrated a clear intention to use them for purposes that serve the public good, specifically the welfare of veterans who have been failed by the very institutions meant to protect them." She straightened in her seat, her voice taking on a formal quality. "It is therefore the ruling of this court that the assets contained in the facility known as the Hayes Bunker are hereby awarded to the petitioner, Marcus Reeves, free and clear of any federal claim. The government's motion to reclaim these assets is denied." The courtroom erupted. Cheers, gasps, the pounding of feet on wooden floors. Reporters scrambled for the exits, desperate to be the first to break the news. Veterans embraced each other, tears streaming down weathered faces. And at the petitioner's table, Rosa threw her arms around Marcus while Danny and Hank pounded his back, and Elaine wept quietly into her handkerchief. It was over, they had won, but even in that moment of triumph, Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity that made the trial preparation look leisurely by comparison. Rosa worked with a team of accountants and financial advisors to establish the legal structure for what would become the Colonel Edward Hayes Foundation. The process was Byzantine, involving trust documents, tax filings, non-profit certifications, and endless meetings with lawyers and regulators. But slowly, methodically, it came together. The first major disbursement went to Danny's shelter in Baltimore. $3 million, enough to pay off the back rent, repair the heating system, and expand into the adjacent building that had been sitting vacant for years. Marcus flew up for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing beside Danny as they welcomed the first residents into the new wing, 47 beds in clean, warm rooms, each one a promise that had finally been kept. "I never thought I'd see this day," Danny said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We were 3 months from closing when you called me. 3 months from telling all those guys that we couldn't help them anymore." "Now you can help even more," Marcus replied. "This is just the beginning," and it was. Over the following year, the foundation established a network of support centers across the eastern seaboard, 10 facilities in the first 12 months, with plans for dozens more. Each center offered not just shelter, but comprehensive services: mental health counseling, job training, legal assistance, medical care, and perhaps most importantly, community. a place where veterans could connect with others who understood, who had walked the same difficult path. Hank took charge of security and logistics, building a team of fellow veterans who brought military precision to the Foundation's operations. They established protocols, trained staff, and created an infrastructure that could sustain the organization for decades to come. Rosa headed the legal advocacy division, fighting for veterans who had been denied benefits, challenging unfair discharges, and holding the VA accountable for its failures. She won case after case, each victory chipping away at a system that had grown too comfortable, ignoring the people it was supposed to serve. And Elaine, despite her age, became the Foundation's spiritual center. She visited every new facility, spoke at every opening ceremony, shared her father's story with anyone who would listen. She reminded everyone, staff, volunteers, and veterans alike, that they were part of something larger than themselves, a legacy that stretched back half a century and forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. But for Marcus, the most important work was personal. The Foundation paid for his treatment, real treatment, not the endless cycle of missed appointments and lost paperwork that the VA had offered. He worked with therapists who specialized in traumatic brain injury, who understood the unique challenges facing combat veterans, who didn't give up when progress came slowly. For the first time in years, the nightmares began to fade. Not completely, some wounds never heal entirely, but enough that he could sleep through most nights without waking in terror. Enough that he could think clearly, speak coherently, plan for a future he had once believed was lost. And then, one autumn afternoon, he made a phone call he had been putting off for 2 years. Diana answered on the third ring. Her voice was cautious, uncertain. "Marcus, is that really you?" "Yeah." He swallowed hard, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "I know I don't have any right to call. After everything that happened, after the way I pushed you away. But I needed to say something. Something I should have said a long time ago." Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, "I'm listening." "I'm sorry." The words came out rough, broken, carrying the weight of all the pain he had caused. "Not for being sick. I know that wasn't my fault. But for shutting you out. For making you carry a burden you never signed up for. For not letting you help when help was all you wanted to give." He heard her breath catch, heard something that might have been a sob. "I'm getting better," he continued. "Found people who know how to help. Found a purpose, too, something that matters. And I wanted you to know that you were right. You couldn't save me, but you weren't supposed to. I had to find a way to save myself." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Diana's voice came through, thick with emotion but steady. "I saw you on the news, the trial, the Foundation, all of it." She paused. "I couldn't believe it was the same man. You looked so different, stronger, like you'd found whatever was missing." "I think I did." Another silence, this one softer. "I'm glad," she finally said. "I really am. What you're doing, it matters. It helps people. And that's the man I married, the one who wanted to make a difference." Marcus closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. This wasn't a reconciliation. Too much time had passed, too much damage had been done. But it was something else, something just as valuable. Closure. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. For trying as long as you did. For not giving up until you had to." "Thank you for calling, for letting me know you're okay." Diana's voice softened. "Take care of yourself, Marcus, and keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you." After he hung up, Marcus sat alone in his office for a long time. The walls were lined with photos now, ribbon cuttings, grateful veterans, the faces of people whose lives had been changed by what he'd found in that bunker. Each one a reminder that his suffering hadn't been meaningless, that everything he'd endured had led him here. He thought about Colonel Hayes, waiting in the darkness, about Elaine, carrying her father's secret for decades, about the system that had failed them all and the foundation that was slowly, methodically, building something better. And he realized, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The 2-year anniversary of the trial fell on a Tuesday in early March, the same kind of grey winter day that had marked its beginning. But this time, Marcus wasn't climbing courthouse steps surrounded by uncertainty and fear. He was standing in front of a brand-new building in Baltimore, its glass doors gleaming in the weak sunlight, its sign reading Hayes Veterans Center in bold letters. The crowd that had gathered was different too. Not reporters and lawyers and government officials, but veterans, hundreds of them, who had come from across the country to witness this moment. Men and women who had served in every conflict from Vietnam to Afghanistan, who had struggled with the same demons Marcus had faced, who had found hope in the Foundation's work. Danny stood beside him, his shelter now the flagship of a network that spanned 15 states. Rosa was there too, fresh from another courtroom victory, her legal team having secured benefits for thousands of veterans who had been unjustly denied. And Hank, still vigilant, still watchful, but with a smile that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Elaine sat in a place of honor near the front, her father's photograph in her lap. She was frailer now, her steps slower, but her eyes still held that same quiet fire. She had lived to see her father's legacy fulfilled, to witness the transformation of his hidden fortune into something that would outlast them all. Marcus stepped to the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. Some he recognized, veterans from the early days, staff members who had been with the Foundation since the beginning. Others were strangers, drawn here by a story they had heard, or an article they had read, or simply the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was fighting for people like them. He cleared his throat. 2 years ago, he began, I was sleeping under a bridge. I had lost everything, my career, my marriage, my sense of who I was. The country I had served had forgotten about me, and I had started to forget myself. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Then I found something. A vault hidden in the hills, filled with money that had been waiting for 50 years to be used, and I had a choice. I could take that money and disappear, buy myself a comfortable life, pretend none of this had ever happened. Or I could do something harder, something that scared me more than any battlefield I'd ever faced. He paused, letting the words settle. I could try to make it mean something. He looked at Danny, at Rosa, at Hank, at Elaine, at all the people who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. I didn't do this alone. None of us did. Every victory we've had, every life we've changed has been the work of hundreds of people, thousands really, who refused to accept that veterans had to suffer in silence, who believed that the system could be fixed, that the forgotten could be remembered, that hope wasn't just a word but a promise. His voice grew stronger. This building behind me isn't just a veterans center, it's a statement. It says that we see you, we value you, we will not let you disappear into the cracks while we look the other way. He pointed to the crowd. Every one of you represents someone who was told they didn't matter. Every one of you is proof that they were wrong. The applause that followed rolled over him like a wave, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes had found someone at the edge of the crowd, a young man, barely out of his 20s, wearing an army jacket that was too thin for the weather. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he stood apart from the celebration like he wasn't sure he belonged. Marcus recognized that look. He had worn it himself, not so long ago. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus made his way through the well-wishers and donors and reporters, ignoring the hands that reached out to shake his, the voices that called his name. He walked straight to where the young man stood, alone and uncertain at the edge of everything. "First time here?" Marcus asked. The young man startled, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw the news about the opening. Thought maybe—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. I don't know what I thought. What's your name? Tyler. Tyler Brooks, Sergeant, 3rd Infantry. Well, former sergeant. His voice caught. They discharged me 8 months ago. Medical said I wasn't fit for service anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. And since then? Tyler looked away, his eyes fixed on something Marcus couldn't see. Since then, it's been hard. Via appointments that never happen. Jobs that don't work out. My girlfriend left. My family doesn't know what to say to me. He laughed bitterly. Feels like I'm disappearing, you know? Like every day there's a little less of me left. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. The wind picked up, carrying the sounds of celebration from the building behind them. I know exactly how that feels, he finally said. 3 years ago, I was right where you are, sleeping in a tent, eating out of dumpsters, waiting for the world to finish forgetting about me. Tyler's eyes widened. You? But you're the guy, the one who found all that money, the one who built all this. Yeah, Marcus smiled faintly. And before that, I was nobody. Just another broken soldier the system threw away. He placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder, feeling the tension beneath the thin fabric of his jacket. But here's what I learned. Being forgotten doesn't have to be permanent. Sometimes you just need someone to remind you that you're still here, that you still matter. Tyler's eyes glistened. How? How do you come back from that? One day at a time, one step at a time, and you don't do it alone. Marcus gestured toward the building behind them. That's what this place is for. That's what we're all for. Veterans helping veterans, because nobody else understands like we do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Simple, white, with the Foundation's logo and a phone number. This is my direct line, he said, pressing it into Tyler's hand. You call that number any time, day or night. You're struggling at 3 in the morning, you call. You need someone to talk to, you call. You feel like you're disappearing again, you call. He met the young man's eyes. You're not alone. Not anymore. Tyler stared at the card, then at Marcus, then at the building full of people who had once been exactly where he was now. Why? He whispered. Why do you care about some random guy you just met? Marcus thought about Colonel Hayes, waiting in the darkness, about Elaine, keeping faith for 50 years, about the letter that had started everything. Use it for those the system forgot. Because someone cared about me when I needed it most, he said, and now it's my turn to pass it on. He watched as Tyler walked into the building, watched as a staff member approached him with a smile and a warm handshake, watched as the young man took his first tentative steps toward a future he had stopped believing in. This was why he had torn up that $50 million check. This was why he had fought through trials and threats and sleepless nights. Not for the money, not for the recognition, not for anything the world considered valuable. For this. For moments like this. For the chance to tell another forgotten soul, you're not alone. Not anymore. Elaine found him still standing there as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. My father would have been proud, she said softly, not of the buildings or the money or the headlines, but of that. She nodded toward the doors through which Tyler had disappeared. Of you seeing someone who needed help and refusing to walk away. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. They stood together in the fading light, two guardians of a legacy that had finally found its purpose. What happens next is up to all of us. Every small act of kindness, every moment when we choose to see instead of look away, every time we refuse to let someone disappear, that's how we build a world worth living in. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more. And if you know a veteran who's struggling, reach out. Sometimes a single conversation can change everything. The man who once had nothing had become the one who gave everything. Not because he found a fortune in a hidden vault, but because he found something far more valuable buried beneath his own despair. the courage to believe that even the most broken things can be made whole again. $300 million could build shelters, fund programs, change policies. But it took something money couldn't buy to truly transform lives: compassion, persistence, and the stubborn refusal to accept that anyone was beyond saving. Marcus Reeves had been forgotten by the country he served. He had slept under bridges while the world walked past. He had lost everything that once defined him. But in losing himself, he found a purpose greater than he had ever imagined. And in being forgotten, he became impossible to ignore. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or cash or bearer bonds. Sometimes they're the second chances we give each other, the hands we extend in the darkness, the simple words that remind someone they matter. Marcus understood that now, and as he watched the last rays of sunlight fade over the Hayes Veterans Center, surrounded by the people who had become his family and the legacy he had helped create, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of the story. It was where everything finally began. Anyone can make a difference if they're brave enough to try and stubborn enough not to quit. As the stars emerged over Baltimore and the Veterans Center glowed with warmth and welcome, Marcus Reeves didn't just see a building. He saw a beacon lighting the way for everyone who had ever been lost in the dark. The man who bought nothing but a desperate hope had become the founder of something that would outlast them all. Because for Marcus and for every forgotten soul he fought to remember, the mission was never really about money. It was about proving that no one, no matter how broken, was ever truly beyond repair. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep the journey going. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe every veteran deserves to come home, not just to a country, but to a community that will never let them be forgotten again.